In the cold South Atlantic, the British task force had one weakness Argentina understood very well. It was not the number of ships. It was not the courage of the sailors. It was the two aircraft carriers at the heart of the operation, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. If either carrier was badly damaged, the campaign to retake the Falkland Islands could be thrown into crisis. If both were lost, the operation could become impossible. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces landed on the Falklands, beginning a short but intense war over islands more than 8,000 miles from Britain. Within days, Britain assembled and dispatched a naval task force, built around its carriers, escorts, amphibious ships, merchant vessels, and submarines. But geography immediately favored Argentina. Its aircraft could operate from bases on the mainland. British ships had to fight at the end of a long supply line, in violent weather with limited air cover and no nearby friendly airfields. At first glance, Argentina appeared to have the advantage in the skies. The British force initially had only 20 Sea Harriers available on Hermes and Invincible, and those aircraft had to defend the fleet, protect the landing force, intercept Argentine raids, and maintain combat air patrols over a huge ocean battlefield. Opposing them were Argentine Navy and Air Force aircraft operating much closer to home, including Mirage fighters, Dagger strike aircraft, Skyhawks, Super Attenders, and maritime patrol aircraft searching for the British fleet. This is why the carriers mattered so much. They were not just ships. They were the floating airfields on which the entire British campaign depended. Every landing plan, every convoy movement, every helicopter lift, every defensive patrol depended on them remaining afloat. Argentina did not need to defeat the whole Royal Navy. It only needed to find the carriers and strike them hard enough to force Britain to withdraw. And Argentina tried. It used reconnaissance aircraft, long-range strike missions, Exocet missiles, low-level bombing attacks, and careful analysis of British flight patterns. Its pilots showed extraordinary bravery, often attacking through intense anti-aircraft fire at wave-top height. Yet, despite repeated efforts, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible survived the war. The question is not whether Argentina lacked courage. It did not. The real question is why, with aircraft, missiles, and determined pilots, Argentina still could not sink Britain's aircraft carriers. The answer begins with the difference between danger and reach. Argentina had weapons that could kill ships. It had pilots trained to fly low over the sea, attack through radar coverage, and release bombs at frighteningly close range. It also had a navy that, at the beginning of May, still hoped to catch the British task force before the landings could begin. But sinking a carrier required more than courage. It required finding the carrier, reaching it at the right moment, penetrating its escorts, and delivering weapons that actually worked. The first serious chance came not from the mainland, but from Argentina's own aircraft carrier, ARA 25 de Mayo. There was a historical irony in that ship. She had begun life as a British-built carrier, HMS Venerable, from the Second World War generation, later served the Netherlands, and eventually entered Argentine service. In 1982, she was old but still dangerous. With a 4Q Skyhawks, S-2 tracker aircraft, and helicopters aboard, she gave Argentina the possibility of launching a naval airstrike against Hermes and Invincible from the sea rather than from distant land bases. By late April and early May, the Argentine Navy tried to create a pincer. The carrier group operated north of the Falklands, while the cruiser General Belgrano and her escorts moved to the south. In British eyes, this was a dangerous picture. The task force could not simply sail forward and ignore it. A strike from the north, combined with pressure from the south, might expose the carriers to attack at the very moment Britain needed them most. On May 1st, 25 de Mayo's tracker aircraft located the British force. For a brief period, Argentina seemed close to the opportunity it needed. A carrier strike was prepared. Skyhawks could potentially have approached low over the sea, where radar warning time was limited. But then the South Atlantic produced one of the war's strangest turns. The carrier needed enough wind over the deck to launch heavily loaded aircraft safely. The conditions were unsuitable. The strike did not go. This was not cowardice or indecision. It was the hard physics of carrier aviation. A bombed-up Skyhawk needed help from the ship's catapult, the ship's speed, and the wind itself. Without that combination, the aircraft could not safely leave the deck with the load required for a decisive attack. In that single moment, Argentina's best naval chance began to slip away. At almost the same time Argentina's carrier was losing its chance in the north, the southern half of the Argentine naval plan was being broken apart. HMS Conqueror, a British nuclear-powered submarine, had been shadowing the cruiser General Belgrano and her escorts. The Belgrano was old, but still dangerous. She was armed, escorted, and positioned in a way that British commanders believed could threaten the task force as part of a wider movement around the islands. On May 2, 1982, permission was given to attack. Conqueror fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes. 2 hit the cruiser. Within minutes, General Belgrano was mortally damaged, and her sinking became one of the most controversial and decisive events of the Falklands War. Whatever the political argument that followed, the military effect was immediate. One side of the Argentine naval pincer had been destroyed, and the remaining Argentine surface fleet now had to consider what British submarines could do. This changed the carrier war without a direct attack on the carrier itself. ARA 25 de Mayo had already failed to launch its Skyhawks because the wind conditions were unsuitable. Now, after the loss of Belgrano, the danger from British submarines became impossible to ignore. The Argentine Navy could no longer assume that its major ships could operate near the exclusion area, threaten the British carriers, and return safely. The unseen submarine had become more frightening than the visible fleet. For Britain, this was exactly what was needed. The Royal Navy did not have to sink every Argentine ship. It had to prevent Argentina's navy from interfering with the campaign. Once the carrier withdrew toward Argentine waters, the best chance of a sea-launched carrier strike against Hermes and Invincible disappeared. Argentina could still attack from the air, and those attacks would soon become deadly, but the shape of the threat had changed. From that point onward, Argentina's effort to sink the British carriers depended far more on land-based aircraft and missile attacks. That brought a new set of problems. Mainland airfields were far away from the islands. Pilots had to fly long distances over open ocean, often at very low altitude, while conserving fuel and searching for ships in poor weather. They could strike with courage, but courage could not remove the limits of range, navigation, fuel, and time over target. So the war moved into its next phase. Argentina still had aircraft capable of killing ships, but reaching the right ships became the real battle. Once the Argentine carrier withdrew, the war became a race between search and concealment. Argentina still had aircraft that could reach the British fleet, but the carriers were no longer waiting in the open. Hermes and Invincible were kept well to the east of the Falklands, away from the most predictable attack routes and outside the easiest reach of land-based aircraft. This protected the center of the task force, but it created a painful contrast. The ships closest to the islands faced the heaviest blows, while the carriers had to survive by staying far enough back to keep the campaign alive. For Argentine pilots, every mission against the fleet became a demanding calculation. They had to take off from the mainland, fly hundreds of miles across empty water, avoid British radar where possible, find ships that were constantly moving, attack at very low level, and still keep enough fuel to return. Low-level flying helped them approach under radar coverage, but it also made navigation harder and reduced the time available to identify targets. In the confusion of combat, a destroyer, frigate, transport, or decoy formation could become the target instead of the carrier. The British understood this problem and used it. The task force was not arranged as a simple cluster with the carriers in the middle waiting to be hit. Warships with radar and missiles formed layers of defense. Sea Harriers flew combat air patrols. Escorts, electronic emissions, weather, distance, and movement all complicated Argentina's search. The Royal Navy could not stop every attack, and it paid heavily for that. Ships such as HMS Sheffield, HMS Coventry, HMS Ardent, and HMS Antelope were lost, and others were damaged. But many of these losses happened because the outer and inner layers of the fleet absorbed attacks that otherwise might have reached more vital ships. This was the harsh logic of carrier protection. The carriers had to be preserved because without them Britain could not maintain air cover over the landing force. The escorts accepted danger because their role was to shield the operations center of gravity. Argentina's pilots repeatedly proved they could hit British ships. What they could not consistently do was locate and strike the two ships Britain most needed to protect. That failure was not caused by lack of bravery. It was caused by distance, fuel limits, imperfect intelligence, moving targets, and a British defensive system designed to make the carriers the hardest ships in the ocean to find. The missile threat gave Argentina its most modern and psychologically powerful weapon. On May 4th, 2 Argentine super-attenders attacked HMS Sheffield with Exocet missiles. One missile struck the destroyer, and Sheffield later sank. For Britain, the lesson was immediate. If an Exocet could cripple a destroyer, then an Exocet reaching Hermes or Invincible could change the entire war. This forced the British to make a difficult trade. Keeping the carriers farther east reduced the chance that Argentine strike aircraft could reach them, but it also reduced the time sea Harriers could spend over the islands. The aircraft had to fly out from the carriers, patrol, intercept, fight, and then return before fuel became critical. Every extra mile of distance protected the carriers, but it weakened air cover over the troops and ships closer to shore. Argentina tried to exploit this tension. Its pilots attacked the landing area at San Carlos, the radar picket ships, escorts, transports, and supply vessels. The attacks were often flown at extremely low level, sometimes so low that bombs failed to arm properly before impact. That failure saved some British ships, but it did not make the attacks harmless. British losses mounted, and each damaged ship reminded commanders that the carriers were still the ultimate prize. The Exocet strike on Atlantic Conveyor showed how close the danger came. The merchant ship was not an aircraft carrier, but it carried aircraft, helicopters, stores, and equipment vital to the campaign. Its loss deprived the British of helicopters that would have made movement across the islands easier, forcing more troops to march over difficult ground. Once again, Argentina had hit a valuable ship, but not the carrier itself. The reason was the same pattern repeated in a different form. Detecting a naval force was one thing. Identifying the right target in a moving formation was another. The British used distance, escorts, radar control, decoys, and the natural confusion of the South Atlantic to reduce the chance that Argentine weapons would find Hermes or Invincible. The carriers were protected not by invisibility, but by layers of uncertainty. By late May, Argentina had proved that British ships could be sunk. But it had not solved the harder problem. To stop the British campaign, it needed to destroy the floating airfields behind it. And those airfields remained just beyond decisive reach. In the end, Argentina's failure to sink Britain's carriers was not caused by one mistake. It was the result of several barriers working together. The Argentine carrier lost its chance when weather denied it the wind needed for launch. The sinking of General Belgrano then forced the surface fleet back toward safer waters. After that, land-based aircraft had to fight at the edge of their range against moving targets protected by escorts, sea Harriers, radar control, and distance. Hermes and Invincible survived because Britain understood what it could not afford to lose. The Royal Navy accepted damage elsewhere to protect the two ships that made the campaign possible. Argentina's pilots struck with skill and courage, sinking and damaging British vessels, but most attacks fell on the ships closest to the islands, not on the carriers far to the east. When Argentina surrendered on June 14, 1982, the carriers were still operating. That fact explains much of the war's final outcome. Britain had kept its floating airfields alive long enough to land troops, support the advance, and retake the islands. Thanks for watching. If you found this story useful, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone interested in military history.